All right, so we've made a transition now from covering the skills of self-awareness like we've been doing the last few weeks, and we're moving into the a different skill set of communication. This week I've intended to leave things a little light for you, mostly because you've had a lot the last few weeks, especially this past week, and you'll have one of your major assignments due this week, the community resource reflection. So there's really only one assignment that's related to week 7 that's due this week. That's in addition to the community resource reflection. So read through the PowerPoint and go over it with me now as I talk about it a little bit, and that will help you through that one assignment related to week 7. And I've also uploaded what's titled the Summative Skills handout. That covers in brief the mindfulness facets or skills that we talked about very briefly, covered there, and then more specifically the communication skills that we're just now getting into. You don't have to do anything with that yet except read over it and be slightly familiar with it. We'll continue to refer back to it as we go. So I do want to review a couple of things related to attachment theory. It seems like there was a little bit of confusion with the handout, the 5, I think it was the 5 components or the 5 elements of secure attachment. So there were 2 that I felt seemed to be confusing to some, and I wanted to bring that out and discuss it and describe it a little more detail. So the 5 are collaborative or contingent communication, reflective dialogue, emotional communication, a shared coherent narrative, and repair. And from what I gathered, the collaborative communication seemed to be confused with what we might normally think of as being collaborative. If we were in a team setting and we were having a group meeting, as professionals say, we would be collaborating and using collaborative communication by sharing ideas, listening openly to one another, and things like that. And it's similar in the attachment theory, but specifically what it refers to is the action or the effort to remain attuned and responsive to the quality and timing of signals from the child as you're interacting with them. And so those signals can be verbal or nonverbal, and your job to exercise contingent or collaborative communication is to remain open to them, read them the best you can, and be responsive to them, to shape your how you respond to the child based on what you see from the child. And the other element that seemed to be a little confusing was reflective dialogue. It seems to be confused with self-reflection, as like the self-reflection assignments I give you, like you're thinking about yourself, you're using introspection to think about your own habits and things. That's not quite what it means here. Reflective dialogue means we're, as the adult interacting with the child, we're making an attempt to make sense of the inner world of the child. We're attempting to basically take as good of a guess as we can as to the state of mind that the child is experiencing within themselves, and then verbally state that back to the child. And it's very often highlighting emotional experiences. When that happens, it's often the case that it's the phrase is prefaced by something like, it seems like you feel sad, it seems like you're really disappointed just now, those kinds of things. It's like you're taking a guess at the inner world of the child, and it helps them make sense of that. So, okay, yeah, I am sad. That's what that feeling is. That then they know what to call it, and when you know what to call your emotional experiences, they're much more able to be regulated. So those were a couple of points that seemed a little confusing, so I wanted to touch base on them. So attachment is something that we'll likely talk about again and is definitely important to consider. So let's move on to communication now. This week we're just covering the very broad basics or introduction to what communication is, and we're getting into the skills of it starting next week. In general, though, I want it to be known that it's likely that we don't really understand all about communication. It's a pretty complex and fairly mysterious aspect of human life. And one thing we do know, however, is that it's important to recognize that one cannot not communicate. We're constantly communicating, and only a fraction of what we communicate is verbal. A great deal, the majority of what we communicate to others, what others, quote, hear from us, is nonverbal. How we look, how we sound, the tone of how we sound, our posture and our gestures and things like that. And there's likely a lot of unconscious perception that goes on in communication too. As we go through these, that we're going to cover 3 different models of communication in this short PowerPoint here, and I've sort of described them, or hopefully will describe them as being ways of explaining different ways of communicating, or explaining how we have understood communication in the past, but also these are 3 ways that we can intentionally communicate to others with different goals in mind. So linear communication is one of the 3, and this could be considered communication as action. It's linear, means like related to a line, and it's basically one way from speaker to receiver, from sender to receiver. As an explanatory model, a way that we can understand communication, this is how it's been viewed in the past, and it's in general an oversimplified understanding. It captures the attitude of my message, as I understand it, is exactly what you receive. That's as though I'm picking up a package and handing it to you. It's the same thing as when I had it. Now that's not quite, as we'll come to find out in a minute, what communication is really like, but that's an understanding that we've had in the past. It's linear in direction, like I said, so it's like a line, direct one to another. And we sometimes adopt this stance of linear communication, like, for instance, as people give speeches, that not always necessarily using feedback from others. There are other examples of maybe more assertive or even aggressive kinds of conversations where there's no consideration of the reception of the messages. And in general, it's one-way signals. Circular communication, on the other hand, has to do with the circle, obviously, as a shape of a circle, is communication as interaction. So the way that communication can be understood in this way is that it's a continual cycle of feedback. So the speaker relays a message, and then the receiver provides feedback about what they heard, and the speaker takes that into account. The understanding is generally that my message is what they receive, but I can clarify it and make sure it's as specific as possible based on how they seemed to hear it. Okay, this is two-way signal. So I'm sending to you, you're sending to me at the same time. This is typically adopted as a stance when one wants to understand more deeply how the other is hearing them, which is a good idea. Another model that's presented in our text is what's called nonlinear. So as opposed to just circular, where it's kind of like a back and forth, nonlinear has the shape of like a tornado. So it starts slightly less complex and then broadens and raises as it goes. So it's that's kind of abstract, but it basically means that it takes a lot of things into account, not just what you heard and what I said. Ultimately, it kind of assumes that there's a lot more to communication than we can actively perceive. So the way that it could be thought of to explain what communication is that me and my message and the listener and their interpretation of my message are all parts of a very complex system of interdependence. This is a pretty abstract way of thinking about communication, but it may be helpful because communication is fairly abstract in itself. Some examples of what we might mean by a complex system of interdependence. It basically can take, when thinking about communication, nonlinear understandings takes the speaker's whole life and their context and their environment and their history and their experiences into account, and it forms and that influences the listener's interpretation based on their history, their past, their experiences, their contexts. Okay, so that's why it's considered non-linear as opposed to just circular. It broadens out and takes a lot more things into account. This could be considered communication as transaction as opposed to communication as interaction. And in taking this as an intentional stance means that you're listening deeply to not just the others, but your own experiences and how they influence how you understand and communicate. So this is, again, a little bit more of an abstract way of thinking. It's also could be thought of as a more complete way of thinking about communication. Okay, so those are three models or ways of understanding and ways of attempting to communicate. And so that's the assignment that you'll be asked to complete this week will be based on describing those three in contrast with one another. And so to set us up for what will be coming in the next few weeks, what I'm going to do is just briefly go over a few concepts about face-to-face communication and written communication, and we'll dive into the specifics of those later. But face-to-face communication, basically we can think of that as being broken into two branches. One we can call linguistic, or the book calls it symbolic, but we can also consider it verbal in general, and also a non-linguistic, which the book calls non-symbolic, or what we could call non-verbal as well. So linguistic or verbal or symbolic refers to speech communication, written language, picture-based forms of communication, and sign language. These are things that we exchange in a certain way, face-to-face, that we do so consciously, and we do so with intention and purpose, or on purpose. And as opposed, in contrast to that, non-linguistic or non-verbal is basically all the things we might consciously use to communicate, but also is just going on all the time, whether or not we're consciously controlling it. And so that includes eye contact, facial expression, tone of voice, posture of your body, gestures of your hands, the timing of your speech or other interactions, and the intensity of your speech and other interactions. So those are two branches of communication, and the non-linguistic or the non-verbal, as I mentioned earlier, basically accounts for a majority of how we communicate with one another and what we hear and what we understand from one another. We'll be going into more depth about the actual skills of utilizing those two branches in different ways as the weeks roll out. And written communication, we're not going to go into a lot of depth this week, but I want to set up a couple of ideas about how we are going to approach it. Written communication has to be purposeful. We have to know why we're writing, why we're what we're trying to get out of the exchange or the written communication with the other. Written communication has to take into account who we're writing to, who they are, how they might read it, how they might filter through the information. Written communication has to always be as clear as possible, and being concise, being succinct are two really important traits in written communication, as opposed to being on and on and on. And one question you might always ask yourself is, can I say this clearer? Can I say this in more of a simplified and direct way so that I have to write less, they have to read less, and the same message is received? Okay, and that's one benefit of written communication, is that you can, try again. You can type it out and read it, and well, maybe that didn't go so well, or that didn't sound right. so you can edit it. And that's a really helpful aspect of written communication. And lastly, about written communication is the consideration of different different conventions of writing. So, is your written communication more of a technical kind of tone, or is it more conversational? Are you using figures of speech, or are you trying to be as grammatically correct as possible? And that has a lot to do with clarity, it has a lot to do with audience, it has a lot to do with purpose, but these are just the ways that the rubber hits the road as you're writing. And it can be considered that there can be a pretty important balance between the informal kind of stance of writing, when that's appropriate, when you know who you're writing to and that's an appropriate thing, versus or in balance with a professional stance. And maintaining a professional stance is actually something we're really specifically going to dive into in a couple of weeks. So we'll be definitely getting back to some of these ideas, but that's just in general what we need to think about as we're talking about written communication. As we go about our communication experiments, which we'll talk about later, and as we try samples of written writing and things like that, one thing to pay attention to are the expectations and possible alterations of communication styles. That means ways that you might have to change your normal communication habits to fit the audience that you're speaking to, writing to. There's a very interesting table, it's table 2.9, I'm not sure what page that is in our text, but you can look it up, that describes some possible alterations. Notice that's possible, it definitely isn't a rule, a table of rules, but different demographics and individuals from different cultural backgrounds may have different expectations of what they of communication with others. Different backgrounds will naturally lead each of us to have different expectations from other people, and you as the professional knowing that and preparing yourself for that can be a really helpful thing. There should be, however, a balance of complementarity and alteration. So what I mean by that is, if you're complementing the language that the other is using or the style of communicating the other has, then that means that you are expressing yourself as you might naturally express yourself, in a way that complements but doesn't match the others necessarily. And there's also a degree of mirroring or altering your communication style to match who you're speaking with that can be effective too. And so those two things can be played with, and there is a sort of balance that can be struck. And that'll be something that you'll have chances to experiment with, as we get through some of the assignments in the later weeks. Okay, that's all I have to say about content this week. There are 3 reminders that I placed at the end of the PowerPoint slide to, 1, submit your community resource reflection, read over the summative skills handout that I'm not asking you to submit anything for this week, but just to be prepared for the oncoming weeks. And then there's 1 discussion assignment that will be the only week 7 related assignment that I'm asking you to complete. Okay, so you do have 2 things to turn in this week. One of them is the major grade of the major assignment rather of the community resource reflection, and the other is the discussion assignment related to week 7's content. Okay, so if any of this is unclear or you need a little bit more clarification, reach out to me, and otherwise do your best to use what extra time you might have not following through with any extra discussions or anything like that to do some catch up or whatever you need to do to stay on track.